Okay, so I have a sort of meta-cinematic note and then a meta-critical note before I begin my actual paper. I've decided to start filming my own presentations as a sort of addition to any kind of professional portfolio I put forward. So that's my meta-cinematic note. My meta-critical note, I want to say a little bit about what the larger version of this paper did, because I had to very severely cut it down to get it into presentation length. And so I'm looking at 3 different film versions of King Lear, and in the larger paper, one of the things that I sort of discuss is the place of these 3 films in the context of King Lear as a whole. The ways in which they either amplify Shakespeare's text as such, or the ways that they present entirely new texts. So, the title of the paper is Timelines, Temporal Representations in 3 Film Versions of King Lear. Almost since the advent of cinema, directors have adapted Shakespeare's plays. Romeo and Juliet in 1908 and 1936, Twelfth Night in 1910, Hamlet in 1920 in Germany, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1935 are a few early examples. Particularly during the 1960s, with the rise of post-colonialism, feminism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism, the way people read, interpreted, and produced Shakespeare plays began to change. These changed sensibilities were reflected in Shakespeare films from the 1970s to today. The major shift from modernism to postmodernism altered a significant number of cultural concerns and changed Western relations to experience, in every sense of that word, forever. In this presentation, I will examine how pre-modern, modern, and postmodern concepts of time inscribe themselves on the fabric of 3 film versions of King Lear. Now, the shifts from pre-modernism to modernism, and then from modernism to postmodernism, were not instantaneous, but they were profound. Even with something as seemingly, at least in terms of everyday life, rooted in objective experience as time, these 3 periods have profound differences. Pre-modern temporal regulation, or pre-modern time, was regulated by religious and agricultural schedules. Because the majority of Europeans worked in agriculture, both individual days and long-term understandings of time were governed by the sun rising and setting, planting and harvest, wet and dry seasons. The other cultural element marking time was religion. Periodic festivals, Easter, Christmas, and Lent for Christians, and various celebrations for pagans structured the year. With the rise of modernity, the bases of pre-modern temporal regulation eroded. The increasing importance of secular belief structures, science and rationalism most notably, and industrialization undermined religious and agricultural regulations of time. Jürgen Habermas identifies modernity with the belief inspired by modern science in the infinite progress of knowledge and in the infinite advance towards social and moral betterment. Progress, moving from the darkness of ignorance into enlightenment, is a defining feature of the modernist movement, which created a new myth system of historical growth and evolution. Modernist temporalities are conceived as narratives, an idea typified by Marx's theories of dialectic materialism and the evolutionary movement through modes of production. Marx's thought displays the belief in forward progress that Habermas links to the modern project. And in structuring individual days, David Harvey links scientific rationalism to a distinctly regulated experience, which he refers to as factory time, a daily schedule run according to mechanically measured chronology. Modernism regulated and controlled the daily experience of time and Western ways of conceptualizing history and the future in much more rigid ways than pre-modernist temporal systems could have. Now, the shift to postmodernism, beginning in the 1960s, brought another major cultural shift in our relations to time. Whereas modernity established rigid temporal regulation, modernism sought to undo that structure by deconstructing the myth of progress and historical movement upon which modernism depends. One key to this deconstruction is focus on the signifier rather than the signified, which allows postmodernists room to play with surfaces and images. Postmodernists are skeptical about the concept of objective reality apart from linguistic or rhetorical representations. Jean-François Lyotard puts it, not, I can prove something because reality is the way I say it is, but as long as I can produce proof, it is permissible to think reality is the way I say it is. The supremacy of language or rhetoric over content or objective truth allows the appropriation of historical modes, periods, cultures, and images without regard for the context from which those cultural artifacts come. This indiscriminate blending of time periods and cultures fragments temporal imagery. Of course, any film version of a Shakespeare text like King Lear necessarily alters the play's historical context by removing it from its Elizabethan theatrical culture and worldview. But the mode of alteration often demonstrates a working out of the production period's socio-cultural and philosophical concerns. A play like King Lear is extremely adaptable to various contexts, and therefore a good vehicle for exploring modern or postmodern ways to produce, delineate, and regulate time. What are, in my opinion, the three best King Lear film versions, all for different reasons, and my justification is not important to this presentation, demonstrate different temporal realities. First is the 2009 teleplay starring Ian McKellen, directed by Trevor Nunn, a version many of you may be familiar with. Temporally, this is a conservative presentation of the play, using only the timing indicated in Shakespeare's text. In other ways, however, the McKellen teleplay has significant postmodern influences. A film version exemplifying modernist temporality is Soviet director Grigory Kozintsev's 1971 film Temporal Lear, which debuted in the US in 1972. Kozintsev's film is heavily marked by socialist realism, an aesthetic outgrowth of Marxism. Finally, JeanLuc Godard's 1987 French New Wave adaptation of King Lear uses several key postmodern strategies, including temporal layering and fragmentation and linguistic play. Sorry. I suggest that McKellen's teleplay is conservative, in that it presents only the temporality of Shakespeare's play. Shakespeare's King Lear is an unusually bracketed play. There's no past to Lear and the other characters, which all seem to spring into existence at the moment the curtain opens. Both Shakespeare's text and McKellen's teleplay feature only superficial references to anything that occurred before Act 1, Scene 1. They begin with an ambivalent reference to time. The first lines are spoken by Kent. I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. And Gloucester. It did always seem so to us, but now in the division of the kingdom. As is typical of Shakespeare plays, King Lear opens with discussion of prior events, but by the fourth line, Gloucester has already shifted our focus to the present. This focus on the present creates the problematic interpersonal relationships of the play. It seems implausible that Lear would not realize his two eldest daughters' treacherous nature, or that Gloucester could be so deceived by Edmund. The play and McKellen's film require accepting that these fathers have no notion of their children's natures, and that the monarch doesn't know which nobles are loyal. References to the future are equally sparse. In the last scene, after most of the main characters are dead, Lear, Cordelia, Goneril, Regan, Kent, Edmund, and Cornwall, the only major characters left are Edgar and Albany. Edgar's final words, which close the play and the film, look to the future. He says, "We that are young shall never see so much nor live so long." And although this statement ostensibly refers to the future experience of the survivors, the standard of comparison continues to be the preceding generation, Lear's generation. Edgar's understanding of the future is mediated by and implicated in the past, backward-looking to the play's events, rather than forward-looking. This backward-looking is notably challenged in Kozintsev's modernist adaptation. As a Soviet adaptation, Temporal Lear is very obviously inflected by socialist realism, which is an aesthetic outgrowth of Marxist theories of historical evolution and dialectic materialist progress from repressive and exploitative systems to an eventually enlightened period, i.e. communism. Socialist realism is marked by class consciousness, promotion of a revolutionary ideal, and Marxian historical growth. But what makes this film a really unique adaptation is the sheer number of people who simply don't exist in Shakespeare's King Lear. With a Marxist class consciousness, Kozintsev took a play predominantly focused on the aristocracy and created a contrasting social class. The film opens with what Waldo McNear describes as a peasant's feet shod in rags dragging along a muddy road. The camera pulls back and we see a horde of peasants trudging. This describes the ideological underpinnings of Kozintsev's film. The peasants trudge, bowed under the burden of their toil, but moving inexorably into the future. The film also ends with an image of the common people, in addition to their continuous presence throughout. McNear writes that in the final scene, peasants have already begun to move among their charred and still smoking houses to hunt for salvage, indomitably preparing to rebuild their shattered town. Despite the fire and battle ravaging the kingdom, the peasants move steadily and progressively into a future they will build, a future which offers untold potential for freedom, justice, and equality. The deconstruction of Lear's kingdom is a creative deconstruction. David Harvey characterizes the modernist logic behind creative destruction, noting, "How could a new world be created, after all, without destroying much that had gone before? You simply cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs, as a whole line of modernist thinkers from Goethe to Mao have noticed." The need for deconstruction to presage the creation of a new social system is the basic logic of Marx's revolution. Kozintsev's film demonstrates fidelity to this notion of creative destruction and historical progress, while Shakespeare's play presents the destruction without almost any creativity. And while the narrative of Corot Lear follows a progress of creative destruction, indicating faith in modernist progress, even the use of motion within the film suggests a preoccupation with forward movement. From the first image of peasants shuffling to the last image of rebuilding, action is constant in the film. The continuous motion fits with Kozintsev's socialist realism because, in the words of R.B. Parker, the sense of constant movement, restless tracking shots of people walking, marching, and running communicates a sense of violent social change. Like the peasants symbolically trudging into the future, the activity throughout suggests the continuous work of social change, evolution, and development that socialist realism, and Marxism at large, posits. The motion throughout Kozintsev's film represents his modernist faith in cultural progress. JeanLuc Godard, by contrast, rejects modernist narratives of progress. He does, however, deal with pressing postmodern concerns in his 1987 King Lear. The main issue with which he deals is the decline of quality he perceives among fellow artists. And although Godard's film demonstrates an anxiety about the decline of art, his goal is not a regressive one. He moves toward a complex postmodern integration of earlier art forms into contemporary ones. Godard develops what Michel Foucault termed a heterotopia, which David Harvey explains as the coexistence in an impossible space of a large number of fragmentary possible worlds, or more simply, incommensurable spaces that are juxtaposed or superimposed upon each other. In Godard's film, the fragmentary worlds and incommensurable spaces coexisting are a series of artistic visions, most notably Shakespeare's play and Godard's film. Mark Robinson explains how through the fragmented, repetitive pastiche, Shakespeare's Lear remains intact as we watch Godard's. The play is present in our minds, visible in places, hovering alongside the film, untouched and silent. Unlike McKellen's teleplay and Kozintsev's film, which use only Shakespeare's words, Godard's film uses small portions of Shakespeare's text interspersed with his own storyline. Godard's story occurs in a period after Chernobyl, in a time when movies and more generally art do not exist and must be reinvented. The temporal setting of the film itself is postmodern. When Godard appropriates Shakespeare's text into a hypothetical post-Chernobyl future, it abandons notions of the progress of history. Godard envisions a future marked by specific hypothetical events, but the world presented in the film has none of the traditional markers of a post-nuclear society. There are fancy restaurants, book publishing, hotels, and so on. rather than nuclear winter, massive destruction, and other distinct imagery associated with a post-nuclear era. Godard's film presents a world more marked by the uncanny, seeming much like the regular world with only slight differences. What's particularly telling about this film's postmodern self-presentation is the overlaying and interplay of language games. Godard's characters speak Shakespeare's Elizabethan language mixed with the dialects of the 1980s and Don Learo's Prohibition-era mobster slang. Use of multiple dialogues conforms to the postmodern linguistic theories of Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard writes that the social bond is linguistic, but is not woven with a single thread. It is a fabric formed by the intersection of at least two, and in reality an indeterminate number, of language games. Postmodern theories about language games explain the intersections of various dialects in Godard's film, and each linguistic game is layered alongside and coexists in complex intersections with the others. Superimposing these various dialects, all associated with distinct time periods, onto one another brings echoes of those time periods into the future that Godard envisions. This echoing undermines the notion that any given moment has its own culture and ideology built through progress from less to more enlightened society. The other temporal element Godard shows is the production of his own film. Godard's King Lear emphasizes its own methods of production, writing, and relating images. Along with Shakespeare's fragmented text, there's an almost action filming style, which maintains audience awareness that this film is scripted, shot in multiple takes, edited, and stuck together. The audience cannot suspend disbelief, which is a common idea in theater, and imagine that the events on screen could actually happen. Among the metacinematic elements is the scene with Norman Mailer and his daughter Kate finishing their adaptation of King Lear, which is shown twice with slight variations. Mailer is not part of Godard's post-Chernobyl plot, but his presence as a writer layers another temporality onto the already multi-temporal fabric of the film. The pre-filming period spills over into and makes its presence felt within the movie itself. The editing process is similarly incorporated into the film itself, but I don't have time to talk about that. The Elizabethan process of theatrical performance is something we know comparatively little about. Because mechanically reproduced films can be infinitely reviewed and studied, their relationship to process is quite different than that of the theater. Although references provide hints, we have no definite idea how Renaissance actors performed, because stage performance is always rooted in and limited to its own time and place, which means we cannot review performances from that era. However, these films show us that the texts of early plays can be productively and effectively adapted to modern or postmodern socio-cultural and philosophical constructions. Unlike theatrical production, a film's socio-cultural concerns do not fade from the work. Even after the cultural shift to postmodernism, Temporal Lear remains a solidly modernist text. This fidelity to a bygone philosophical and aesthetic tradition complicates postmodernist receptions of the film because the discourse community in which the film is received begins with several fundamentally different assumptions about the world. This foundational shift complicates our reception of Kazintsev's film in much the same way that his film complicates a modernist reception of Shakespeare's text. And someday, in the era following postmodernism, we can speculate that the reception Godard's film meets will be similarly complicated. Thank you.